The teacup slipped from Melissa's hand the moment her knees buckled. My daughter-in-law was gasping on the banquet floor, foam at the corners of her mouth, eyes rolling back. And all I could think was, well, that wasn't supposed to happen to her. Retirement is supposed to taste like freedom, like honey on the tongue after decades of grit. That's what I told myself as I stood in the glow of chandeliers, smiling at familiar faces raising their glasses to me. I'd spent 40 years teaching high school English, corralling rowdy teenagers and sneaking poetry into their lives. And tonight, my colleagues, neighbors, and family had gathered to celebrate my final bell. The banquet hall shimmered with laughter and perfume, silver trays gliding through the crowd, a jazz trio crooning softly in the corner. My son, Daniel, had insisted on the party. "Mum, you deserve a proper send-off," he said, pressing a kiss to my cheek. His wife, Melissa, had been the mastermind behind every detail. She liked to remind me how exhausting it was to plan events, how expensive floral arrangements were, and how she'd sacrificed hours to make it perfect. For once, I gave her credit. The room was beautiful. I remember watching her float from table to table, hair lacquered in place, her pearls catching the light as she laughed a little too loudly at jokes she didn't understand. She looked every inch the devoted daughter-in-law, eager to please. But Melissa never fooled me, not with the way she watched me when she thought I wasn't looking, or how she glanced at my hands like they held the keys to a vault. The toast was supposed to be the grand finale. Daniel tapped his glass, asking for quiet, his voice warm and trembling as he spoke about my dedication, my sacrifices after his father passed, the way I poured myself into both the classroom and the family. People clapped. Some even dabbed their eyes. I raised my tea, my drink of choice since I've never had the stomach for champagne, and offered a few words of gratitude. It should have ended there. Applause, cake, perhaps a slow drive home through the soft night. But fate, or rather Melissa, had other plans. I caught it in the corner of my eye, her hand slipping beneath the tablecloth, fingers curling around a small vial. She tilted it just so, emptying its contents into my steaming cup, then straightened with a practiced smile. And then, the whisper. She leaned toward her friend, her lips barely moving, but I'd taught enough teenagers to know how to read mouths. "Say goodbye to the old lady. Tonight's her last toast." The words slid into me like ice water. My spine stiffened, but my face didn't change. At 71, I'd learned that survival often comes from stillness, from pretending you don't know you've been marked. I swirled the tea gently, watching the ripples, then lifted the cup as if nothing was amiss. My hands didn't shake. My voice didn't falter. When Melissa turned away to greet another guest, I caught the waiter's eye. A quiet nod, a small movement, and I set my cup on his tray before it ever touched my lips. "Would you mind bringing me a fresh one?" I asked, as if I were particular about the temperature. He smiled, oblivious, and disappeared into the kitchen with the tainted tea in hand. I thought that was the end of it. Another narrow escape to tuck into my pocket with the rest. But poison is an unfaithful ally. Within minutes, I heard a gasp, a clatter of glass, and then the sharp cry of someone falling. Melissa was on the floor, her hand still trembling around the rim of a cup she must have snatched in haste. The music died. Laughter froze mid-breath. I remember the sound of her pearls scattering across the parquet as her body convulsed, froth bubbling at her lips. For a moment, no one moved. It was as if the whole banquet hall inhaled and forgot how to exhale. Then chaos. Chairs scraped back. Voices rose in panic. Someone shouted for an ambulance. Daniel pushed through the crowd, his face ashen, kneeling beside his wife. His hands hovered uselessly, torn between helping and not knowing how. Guests clutched each other, whispering theories, their eyes darting between Melissa writhing on the floor and me, calm, still holding a fresh cup of untouched tea. I could feel the shift, the weight of their stares pressing against my back. No one said it aloud, but the silence accused me just the same. And I, standing tall in my retirement banquet dress, thought only one thing. So this is how the game begins. The room smelled of lilies and roasted chicken a few minutes earlier. Now it reeked of panic. Guests pressed handkerchiefs to their mouths, wide-eyed and trembling, as Melissa's body seized against the polished floor. The jazz trio had stopped playing, instruments abandoned mid-song. The silence in the banquet hall wasn't the comforting hush of respect. It was the heavy stillness before accusations begin to bloom. Daniel knelt beside his wife, shaking her shoulders as though he could rattle the poison out of her. "Melissa, stay with me." His voice cracked, raw with fear. I stood a few feet away, unmoving, clutching the fresh cup the waiter had just delivered. I'd taught myself long ago that stillness can be a shield. The more frantic everyone else became, the calmer I grew. A neighbor, Margaret, crouched down and fanned Melissa with a napkin, as though air alone could reverse what had already set in motion. "She's burning up!" someone shouted. Another guest stumbled backward, nearly knocking over a table of desserts, whispering to anyone who'd listen. "She was fine a minute ago." I kept my eyes on Daniel, not Melissa. My son's panic looked genuine, but I saw the flicker when his gaze darted toward me. Brief, fleeting, but sharp as a blade. That suspicion wasn't born in this moment. It had been waiting, festering, just in need of an excuse. The paramedics arrived quicker than I expected, pushing through the crowd with their equipment, their faces set in professional neutrality. They knelt by Melissa, checking her vitals, asking questions Daniel couldn't answer. What did she eat? Did she take any medications tonight? "I don't know," Daniel stammered, eyes glassy. We had champagne, hors d'oeuvres. She's healthy, she's fine. This doesn't make sense." I sipped my tea. Slowly. Deliberately. The lead medic turned to me, perhaps because I was the only one not panicking. "Mom, did you see anything unusual?" Unusual. The word itched on my tongue. I could have said everything. How Melissa had slipped something into my cup. How I'd watched her lean close to her friend and whisper about my last toast. How I'd quietly handed the drink to the waiter before anyone noticed. But truth can be dangerous when it's naked. Too soon, and it looks like hysteria. Too direct, and it sounds like spite. I'd learned in both teaching and in life that timing is everything. "I saw her with a glass," I said, voice steady, "but nothing unusual." She looked pale just before she fell. The medic nodded, scribbling notes, too busy to press further. Daniel looked at me then. Really looked, his face pale, his jaw set tight. For just a heartbeat, his grief took a back seat to calculation. Melissa was lifted onto a stretcher, her arms limp, her breath shallow but steady. The crowd exhaled as though they'd all been holding their lungs hostage. Whispers broke out. Someone muttered about allergic reactions, another about shellfish. But I caught snippets too sharp to ignore. Didn't she have tea? I thought that was Mrs. Carter's cup. No, she always drinks tea, not champagne. Eyes shifted my way again, curious, wary. I smiled faintly, the kind of smile you give when you know you're being studied and you want them to wonder what you know that they don't. Daniel followed the stretcher, clutching Melissa's hand as though he could anchor her back into the living. As they wheeled her through the doors, he glanced back at me once more. Not a glance of comfort or even desperation. It was the look of a man wondering if his mother had just pulled the rug out from under his life. I stayed until the last guest trickled out, offering polite reassurances, hugging shoulders, thanking them for coming. My colleagues hugged me tighter than usual, their eyes darting toward the empty space where Melissa had fallen. The party had been meant to honor my years of service. Now it was a scandal no one would forget. When the last car pulled away, I stood alone in the banquet hall, surrounded by wilting flowers and abandoned glasses. The tea Melissa had poisoned was long gone, taken away by the waiter who had no idea he carried evidence of murder on his tray. I whispered to the empty room, "Melissa, you made your first mistake tonight." And then I added, more quietly, "Daniel, you made yours by letting her sleep didn't come that night." I sat by the window of my quiet house, watching headlights sweep across the street and vanish into the dark. Every tick of the clock felt like a drumbeat, reminding me I was still alive, and someone in my family would rather I wasn't. Melissa hadn't been subtle. That much was clear. She'd poured poison into my tea in a room full of people, banking on the fact that no one pays attention to the old lady's drink. I could almost admire her boldness if it weren't so stupid or desperate. And desperation, I knew, was the real story. I thought about the last few years, Melissa's designer handbags arriving on the porch in boxes big enough to fit a child, the leased SUV parked in their driveway, Daniel's excuses about why his architectural firm hadn't landed the big contracts he promised. I'd written checks more times than I could count. Tuition for my granddaughter, a down payment on their house. Just a bridge, Daniel always said, until things stabilize. Bridges, I learned long ago, can turn into permanent highways if you're not careful. My ledger didn't lie. Nearly $200,000 had flowed from me to them in the past 5 years. At the time, I told myself it was generosity, love, family. But generosity has a way of curdling when the recipient believes it's entitlement. The poisoning attempt wasn't just Melissa's doing. No, Daniel's silence told me plenty. When I'd locked eyes with him as she collapsed, I'd seen something flicker there. Fear, yes, but also recognition. He knew. He may not have mixed the cup himself, but he wasn't blindsided either. I poured myself black coffee at 3 in the morning, the kind strong enough to strip paint, and sat at my kitchen table with a yellow legal pad. Old habits die hard. When life gets tangled, I write it down until the knots loosen. Column 1. Motives. Melissa. Money. Always money. A shortcut to the inheritance she whispered about to her friends. Daniel. Money too, but with the added weight of ego. He wanted to keep his head above water, maintain the life Melissa demanded. And maybe, though it twisted my stomach, he wanted me out of the way before I decided to change my will. Column 2. Methods. Poison. Cowardly but effective. Hard to trace, especially if they dressed it up as a heart attack. At 71, people expect organs to fail. It wouldn't raise eyebrows. Column 3. Mistakes. Melissa had been sloppy, poisoning me in public, whispering within earshot, and drinking from the wrong cup. The universe has a wicked sense of humor sometimes. By dawn, the page was crowded with names, arrows, and question marks. My hand ached, but my mind was sharper than it had felt in years. I brewed another pot of coffee and stared at the rising sun streaking my garden in gold. This house, these walls, had been my fortress since Daniel was 10 and his father had passed. I built my career here, nursed grief here, raised a boy into a man here. And now that boy, the one who once brought me dandelions from the yard, was plotting my exit. I thought about the last time Daniel had asked if I'd considered downsizing. He'd been casual, stirring sugar into his coffee, saying things like, "Wouldn't it be easier on you, Mom?" Less upkeep. At the time, I'd smiled and said no. Now I realized he'd been planting seeds. Melissa must have been watering them daily. The betrayal stung, but anger was steadier than grief. Grief makes you weak. Anger sharpens you. I decided on 2 things that morning. 1. I would not confront them. Not yet. A snake shows its fangs when it feels cornered, and I wanted them to think I was still blind. 2. I would protect myself, quietly and thoroughly, before their next move. I called my attorney's office at 9 sharp and asked for the first available appointment. 20 years of loyalty meant he didn't question the urgency. Before heading out, I stood in my bedroom, looking at the framed photo of Daniel at 6 years old, gap-toothed, holding up a fish he'd caught at the lake. My chest tightened. What had happened between that boy and the man I saw last night? Then I answered myself. Money happened. Greed happened. Melissa happened. I tucked the photo face down on my dresser. Some memories are kinder left in the dark when the present is so much uglier. The game wasn't just survival anymore. It was strategy. And I've always been good at strategy. By the time I walked into St. Mary's Hospital, the air already smelled of disinfectant and unspoken fears. Melissa had been admitted overnight, stabilized, but weak. I told myself I was there to check on her, polite, dutiful. But the truth was, I needed to look her in the eye. Daniel met me in the lobby. He looked like he hadn't slept, his shirt wrinkled, his hair uncombed. To strangers, he might have seemed like a worried husband. To me, he looked like a man calculating what he still had to lose. "Mum," he said, voice low and heavy. "You didn't need to come. Melissa's resting." I touched his arm, studying his face. Of course I needed to come. She's family. His jaw tightened. He guided me toward the waiting area, a plastic paradise of stiff chairs and old magazines. He wouldn't meet my eyes. The doctors think maybe she had a reaction to something. Maybe food, maybe stress. That was the word he landed on. Not poison, not accident. Stress. "And what do you think?" I asked softly. He glanced at me then, a flicker of something unreadable behind his eyes. "I think we should focus on her recovery. That's all that matters now," a careful answer. Too careful. When Melissa finally appeared, pale and fragile in her hospital gown, she clutched Daniel's hand like a lifeline. Her voice was faint, but her performance was strong. "Sarah," she whispered, "I don't know what happened. 1 minute I was fine. The next, everything went black." She squeezed her eyes shut, as though conjuring tears. "The doctors said it could have been exhaustion. I worked so hard planning your banquet. Maybe I pushed myself too far." I sat on the edge of her bed, folding my hands in my lap. "You certainly did go all out," I said, my tone even. "And that toast, you seemed very invested in making it memorable." Her eyes snapped open. A flash of panic crossed her face before she smoothed it into innocence. "I don't remember much of the toast," she said quickly. "Did I embarrass myself?" Daniel's hand tightened on hers. He looked at me with a warning I knew too well. The same look he gave me as a boy when he'd hidden a broken lamp behind the couch. "Don't push. Don't expose me." Melissa sighed dramatically. "The important thing is I'm alive, and that you're safe." Safe. That word tasted bitter on my tongue. "I am safe," I said, letting my gaze linger on her longer than comfort allowed. But that night could have gone very differently, for either of us. Her smile faltered. Daniel jumped in quickly, too quickly. "Mum, Melissa needs rest. We shouldn't talk about this now." I leaned back in my chair, folding my arms. "Of course. Rest is essential after an episode." We sat in silence for a moment, the air thick with everything unsaid. Machines beeped steadily, a nurse shuffled past the doorway, and Melissa's nails tapped against the bed rail in an uneven rhythm. Finally she spoke, voice soft and calculated. "Sarah, you've done so much for us. More than we deserve. I hope you know how much we appreciate your appreciation." Funny choice of word for someone who'd tried to kill me 12 hours earlier. I smiled faintly, the same smile I used to give my students when they tried to bluff through an essay they hadn't read. "I know exactly how much, Melissa." Her face tightened, but Daniel jumped in again, this time with forced cheer. "Mum, why don't we all have dinner together once Melissa's out of here?" A fresh start. No stress. No, Incidents dinner. A fresh start. I could almost laugh at the script they were both reading from. I rose, smoothing my coat. I'll hold you to that. For now, I'll let you rest. As I turned to leave, Melissa whispered something I wasn't meant to hear. So quiet, Daniel probably thought it wouldn't reach me. She knows. I didn't stop walking. Didn't give her the satisfaction of seeing my reaction. But my heart steadied. She was right. I did know. And knowing was far more dangerous for them than ignorance could ever be. By the time I stepped back into the morning light, I'd decided. No more waiting. They thought I was fragile. They thought I was cornered. But I was the one holding the pieces now, and I was ready to start moving them. The morning after the hospital visit, I sat at my kitchen table with a pot of coffee and the silence of an empty house pressing in around me. Silence used to feel like peace. Lately, it felt like a countdown. Melissa's whisper, "She knows," echoed in my head. It wasn't fear in her voice, it was calculation. She knew I wasn't fooled, and now she'd start scrambling to control the damage. That meant I had to move faster. I dialed my attorney, David. 20 years of loyalty meant he didn't waste time with pleasantries. "Sarah, what's happened?" I told him everything. Melissa's hand, the vial, the whisper, her collapse. He didn't interrupt, just scribbled notes, his breathing steady. When I finished, his voice was tight. "We need to act, and we need to be subtle. Do you still have the bottle from the banquet?" "Yes. 3/4 full. Sitting in my kitchen, don't touch it. I'll arrange for discreet testing. If it comes back positive, we'll have leverage. Not just suspicion. Proof. That was the difference between an old woman's story and a criminal charge. After hanging up, I called someone I hadn't spoken to in years. Patricia Williams, a private investigator I'd hired back when I ran the school district's budget committee and needed to vet vendors who were a little too slick. Patricia was good at finding what people wanted buried. "Sarah Carter," she said, her voice warm but sharp. "Retired, at last. I figured you'd be gardening, not calling me." "I'll garden when I can do it without looking over my shoulder," I said. "I need eyes on my son and his wife. Finances, debts, anything they've been hiding." Patricia didn't hesitate. "You'll have a file by Friday." While she went digging, I turned my attention to my house. I called a security company under the guise of package theft. By sunset, I had cameras, motion sensors, and a panic button installed in every room. Let Daniel and Melissa think I was frail. If they set foot in here again, the house would see more than I let on. That evening, Daniel arrived unannounced, holding a bakery box like a peace offering. He kissed my cheek, set the pastries down, and started in with that careful, rehearsed tone. "Mom, Melissa and I have been talking. We worry about you. This house is too big. You're alone. What if something happens?" There it was. The script I'd been expecting. I smiled politely. "Happens? You know, a fall. An accident. After last night, it scared me, Mum. What if it had been you instead of Melissa?" His eyes were earnest, but not innocent. I'd taught too many teenagers to be fooled by sincerity rehearsed in the mirror. He pulled out his phone and showed me glossy photos of a senior community called Sunset Haven. Pictures of smiling retirees doing water aerobics and painting landscapes. "It's not a nursing home, Mum. It's a resort, safety, companionship, activities, and it's close to us. You wouldn't be alone anymore." A tidy pitch, almost convincing, if I hadn't known better. "What does it cost?" I asked, feigning interest. He hesitated. "There's an entrance fee. 400,000. But it covers everything. Meals, medical care, housing. You'd never have to worry again. 400,000. Exactly the kind of dent they'd need in my savings to keep up their lifestyle." I leaned back, sipping my coffee. "It does sound comprehensive." Relief flickered across his face. "Then you'll think about it?" "I'll think about it." After he left, I sat in the kitchen and pulled out my ledger again. Column after column of money I'd handed them. Loans that weren't loans, gifts that weren't gifts. Nearly 200,000 over the years. Now they wanted 400,000 more, and my independence with it. They hadn't tried to kill me just to rush an inheritance. No, this was layered. First, poison. If that failed, persuasion. If persuasion failed, pressure. And if all else failed, they'd find a doctor to declare me incompetent. I tapped my pen against the table, thinking of my students who once tried to plagiarize essays. Always leave yourself 3 outs, I'd tell them, in case your first excuse doesn't fly. Melissa had learned that lesson well, but I'd learned it better. That night, Patricia called back earlier than expected. "Sarah, you'll want to sit down for this." "I'm already sitting." "Your son and daughter-in-law are drowning. Credit cards maxed out. House refinanced 3 times. Business in the red. And there's one more thing. 6 months ago, Melissa took out a life insurance policy on you. $500,000. With herself as beneficiary, my blood went cold." "On me? How is that even allowed?" "She claimed insurable interest as family. The company didn't look too hard. Paperwork says she's your caregiver." I laughed, sharp and humorless. "Caregiver? She nearly made me her corpse." "Sarah," Patricia said carefully, "they're desperate. Desperate people get sloppy, but they also get dangerous. You need to be careful. I intend to be," I said. "I also intend to make sure they regret underestimating me." I hung up, staring at the kitchen window. My reflection looked back at me. Not frail, not beaten, but sharpened. Melissa thought she was clever slipping poison into my tea. Daniel thought he was clever pitching me a gilded prison. They had no idea they were already tangled in their own trap. Because while they were busy scheming, I'd been busy planning. And the one thing my years in the classroom taught me: the test never goes the way the cheater expects. Friday morning arrived grey and damp, the kind of day that feels heavy before it even begins. I woke early, brewed my strongest coffee, and laid the paperwork out neatly on my dining table. To anyone else, it looked like I was preparing to surrender. Admission forms for Sunset Haven, a stack of account statements, even a draft. Power of attorney. To me, it was bait. At 9 sharp, Daniel and Melissa arrived. She was pale but polished, her hospital stay hidden under fresh makeup and pearls. He carried a leather briefcase like a man about to close a deal. They kissed my cheek, their smiles tight, and followed me into the living room where I'd arranged everything. "Well," I said, gesturing toward the papers, "I've thought about what you suggested." Daniel's relief was almost theatrical. "Mum? That's wonderful. We just want what's best for you." Melissa perched on the edge of the sofa, crossing her legs carefully. "Sunset Haven is such a lovely place, Sarah. You'll have everything you need, and we'll be right there for you." I handed them the admission forms, already signed. Melissa's fingers trembled slightly as she flipped through the pages, her eyes flickering with greedy satisfaction. "Perfect," she murmured. "And here," Daniel said, sliding another document toward me, "is the power of attorney. It's just a precaution, but the facility requires it. Once you sign, I can handle the finances so you don't have to stress." I lifted the paper, scanning the dense legalese. I let silence stretch until Melissa's knee began to bounce. Then, with a steady hand, I signed. "Excellent," Daniel said, gathering the papers like a child clutching candy. "You've made the right decision, Mom." Melissa leaned forward, her smile brittle. "You won't regret this." I smiled back. "I know I won't." Just then, the doorbell rang. Melissa stiffened. Daniel frowned. "Expecting someone?" "Yes," I said calmly. "My attorney." But when I opened the door, it wasn't David standing there. It was Detective Morrison, badge flashing at her hip, another officer at her side. "Mrs. Carter," she said briskly, "we need to speak with you about an incident that occurred at your banquet." Melissa's face drained of color. Daniel rose slowly, clutching the briefcase tighter. "What kind of incident?" he asked, his voice wavering. The detective's gaze was steady. "The toxicology report from the hospital shows your wife ingested oleander extract. Not food, not stress. Poison. We also tested the champagne bottle from your event. Same substance. Concentrated. Someone deliberately tampered with it." Melissa's hands flew to her mouth. That, that's insane. Why would I poison myself?" The detective's eyes narrowed. "That's what we'd like to know. But the glass with the highest concentration wasn't originally yours. It was meant for Mrs. Carter." The room seemed to shrink. Daniel turned, staring at Melissa in horror. What did you do?" "I didn't," she shrieked. "Daniel, I swear." I rose from my chair, smoothing my skirt. "I saw you, Melissa. I saw you pour from that vial. I heard your whisper. You weren't careful enough." Melissa's body sagged as though the truth had knocked the air out of her. "You switched the cups," she whispered. "Yes," I said, my voice calm. "I switched them." The detective pulled a file from her bag. "Mrs. Carter, we also discovered your daughter-in-law took out a $500,000 life insurance policy on you 6 months ago, with herself as beneficiary. Combined with the toxicology results, that's more than enough for an arrest." Melissa's protest dissolved into a scream as the handcuffs clicked around her wrists. Daniel stumbled back, his briefcase sliding to the floor, papers spilling across the rug. "Mom," he gasped, his face pale. "I didn't know about the poison. I swear, I didn't know I met his eyes, my heart heavy. But you knew about everything else. Sunset Haven, the power of attorney, the plan to strip me of my life while I was still breathing." His mouth opened, closed, opened again. But no words came. Detective Morrison led Melissa toward the door. She twisted once, her eyes blazing at me. "You think you've won? You have no idea what you've done." I didn't flinch. "Oh, Melissa," I said softly, "I know exactly what I've done." The door shut behind them, and silence fell heavy over the room. Daniel sank into the sofa, burying his face in his hands, the weight of ruin pressing down on him. The briefcase lay open at his feet, papers scattered like broken promises. For the first time in days, I felt steady. The trap had snapped shut, not around me, but around them. And I wasn't finished yet. 3 months later, the roses in my garden bloomed brighter than I'd ever seen. Maybe it was the soil, maybe it was the weather, or maybe it was just the quiet. For the first time in years, my house felt safe. Melissa sat in county jail awaiting trial. Her lawyer was already on television spinning tales about stress, exhaustion, and mistaken intent. But poison doesn't lie. The toxicology reports, the insurance policy, my testimony, they painted a picture too sharp to blur. She'd face years behind bars. Daniel, though, was another story. He hadn't touched the vial. He hadn't poured the poison. But he had stood by while his wife planned my erasure, and he had signed his name to the lies. The district attorney cut him a deal. Conspiracy instead of attempted murder. 3 years. Enough to sting, not enough to bury him. I visited him once, in the sterile visiting room where the air smelled like bleach and regret. He looked smaller somehow, shoulders rounded, eyes rimmed red. "Mum?" he whispered. "I'm sorry. I never wanted it to go that far. I just thought we were drowning." And Melissa kept saying, I let him talk, let him spill excuses and apologies. Then I placed my hand on the cold metal table and said, "You wanted to save yourself by sinking me. That's not how family works." His eyes filled with tears, but I didn't stay to watch them fall. Some things a mother can forgive, some she can't. Oddly enough, it was Melissa's mother, Helen, who became my unexpected ally. She came to me one afternoon, clutching her purse, her face pale but resolute. "Sarah," she said, "I need to tell you something." I remember the champagne tasting strange, bitter, and I remember seeing Melissa by the table before it happened. She lowered her gaze. My daughter tried to kill you. And I almost died. Instead, I poured her tea, fresh, safe, untainted, and we sat together, two women bonded by betrayal. She spoke of her daughter's greed, her obsession with money, her resentment at anyone who had more, and I listened, realizing that grief takes many forms. Hers was losing a daughter to darkness, mine was losing a son to cowardice. If there was any balm in the wreckage, it was Emma, my granddaughter. 16, sharp-eyed, far older in spirit than her years. She called me the night after the arrest, voice trembling. "Grandma, I'm so sorry. I didn't know they were planning anything. Please don't hate me because of them, sweetheart," I told her. "You are nothing like them. Don't carry their sins." She's visited nearly every weekend since, her laughter filling the house the way Daniel's once did when he was her age. She talks about college, about studying law, about making things right in the world. When she looks at me, I see hope, not the brittle kind her parents chased, but the real kind that grows roots. As for me, I've made my peace with lawyers and paperwork. David helped me restructure everything, my estate, my medical directives, even a trust that locks away my assets unless I'm the one signing for them. If anyone ever tries to declare me incompetent again, every dime shifts to charity. Let them chew on that. In the quiet of my study, I sometimes replay Melissa's words. Say goodbye to the old lady. She thought age was weakness. She thought decades of work, grit, and survival had dulled me. She forgot that 71 years teaches you more than books ever can. Patience, timing, and the art of letting others trap themselves. I walk through my garden in the evenings now, the roses blooming, fierce and stubborn. Emma joins me sometimes, asking questions about her grandfather, about the years before money poisoned everything. I tell her the truth, that love built this house, not greed, and that strength isn't about outliving others, but outsmarting the ones who want to bury you. The banquet was supposed to be my farewell toast. Instead, it was my reminder that endings are just beginnings, dressed in sharper clothes. I may be retired, but I am not finished. Not with life, not with love, and certainly not with fighting back. Melissa underestimated me. Daniel underestimated me. Let the world take note. Underestimating an old woman is the most expensive mistake you can make. And as the sun sets each evening, painting the sky in gold, I lift my tea, unsweetened, untouched by anyone's hand but mine, and drink to survival, to peace, to living well, which is always the sharpest revenge.